Now for 9 years and doing a series of talks mostly on history in a series we call Past Meets Present. Actually, I was thinking about that yesterday, that it's been almost 10 years. So I was already working with Jeremy here about planning 2027's lectures. And so the very first lecture I did was in 2017 in honor of the centennial entry, or the entry of the United States to World War I. It's the centennial. So I thought that'd be nice to revisit as a little honor for me in the library from the sense of doing it 10 years. So anyway, just working out like what we'll do next year and kind of making our way through. So a great pleasure to do that. For the past 3 years, up until this year, we married the Past Meets Present, so history, with what there's a library called Citizen Civics. So focus on citizenship and civics, and so we've alternated. As we rolled into this year with the semi-quincentennial, I said, what if? So we're taking the whole year. I'm just letting you know, as a historian, I'm pretty annoyed that a lot of people in the country, Winter Park's doing that. I mean, I think everybody's doing this. We're like, July 4th, that's the end. And I'm like, oh, no. Even when we get to December, which we will be doing semi-quincentennial topics through December, even when we get to December, as hopefully you're aware, it's not over then. In fact, one could argue that the experiment is still not over, but that's a different conversation about whether it is or not. Historians go back and forth as to what you would call revolutionary America, and then when you pick up, is it with Washington we just dive in and say that's the Republic? So a whole different conversation, but it's a lot of fun for us. So we will be doing semi-quincentennial topics all the way through. In December, I will be looking at Washington's saving of the Revolution. We'll spend a little time in that talk looking at who Washington is. We're doing a whole series of topics. At the very end, I'll put some slides up that'll show you the different things, but they are on the Winter Park Library's website. It is just such a pleasure of mine. I do live in Winter Park, to have our beautiful library. I've been a longtime supporter. Anybody else remember your summer reading programs when you were a kid? And we would have like a creature on the back that would have little places for stickers, and you had to read a book, and I love that kind of stuff. So I grew up loving libraries and living in libraries. So my mom would sometimes drop us off and go do something else, and I'd just get a book and read in a corner and come up to the librarian and go, I'm done. You didn't check it out. I know, but I read it. Well, tell me about it. Blah, 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 blah. She said, okay, here's your sticker. Shut up. So in full disclosure, some of you are returning visitors. I have to say this on the front side. I detest this man. And so you need to know that going in. So in full disclosure, some of you have been here when I've talked about John Adams. I adore John Adams. So what that means is I have bias, right? So there's that sense of saying, oh wait, can I listen to this guy? Because he's got bias. This is not the talk about why I don't like Jefferson. So if you're here and you're someone who agrees with me, or if you're here and you're someone you're like, really? Somebody doesn't like Jefferson? And you want to know why, that will slightly come through, but it's not the focus of the talk. What we've been doing in this series for this year is trying to tie everything into the 250, into 1776. So the focus, as you're going to see, will be all of Jefferson's early life leading to his involvement in what we call the Road to the Revolution. We did that talk in April. If you've missed any talks, you'd like to see them, the very last slide, I'll put a QR code up so you can get to my YouTube channel, and you can find all those talks, the ones that I do that are here, and you can find the things that we've covered. So in April, we got to 1774 because I knew we were going to be here. And then in July, just telling you now, you'll see when we get there, what I'm basically going to say is, and he drafted the Declaration. And they passed it. Let's move on. Because there's more I want to tell you about Jefferson in the revolutionary moment. And then we're going to spend all of July's talk in the Declaration. I've already kind of worked it out. I've told you this before, but if you haven't been here, I hope you'll come back. We, those in the audience and I, are going to read the entire Declaration from start to finish. I'm going to have a microphone. I'm going to give it to him. He's going to give it to her. And I'm going to show you the slide up here. And you have a little phrase you're supposed to read. We're going to read it. We'll talk about it some. So we'll do a little preamble-y about what happened. Then we're going to focus the bulk of our time on the Declaration. So that will not be today either, although, as I'm sure you're aware, hopefully you're aware, Jefferson is the principal draftsman. He's not the author. Do not insult the Declaration by calling him the author. He's the draftsman of the Declaration. And you'll see that drafting is a key thing in his life because I'm trying to be as fair as possible, he's a brilliant writer. Jefferson is a brilliant writer. So you're going to see this repeatedly as we go along, so that hopefully you see it now. So when you get to July, if you come back to July or just in your July and you're reading the Declaration and you'll see people on TV calling him the author, erroneously, you can say, I know why he got asked to do the writing. He and Adams had a little story. They had two different stories. Here's why. Nobody knows why. But I'll tell you the reason why is because everybody in the room recognized he's the best writer. He's a brilliant, brilliant writer. So, not to talk about a takedown. My wife wants me to write the book on it because I get very impassioned about that fact. Maybe in a future year, we'll come back to him and I will go forward and tell you from Revolution period on why, but that's not today. All right, so I'm glad you're here. You can't always interrupt me with questions, and I'll try to have time at the end. But I will tell you, we're going to be moving fast today because there's a ton to cover because he's so juicy. He's so good in the process. All right, let's see if it works. Okay, because there's over here on the screen, tell me something. So he's born early. Actually, in one sense, he's born late. He's the youngest, really, of the founding fathers. So James Madison, not one of the founding fathers, right? He's not one of them. He's young, right? John Quincy Adams, they're the second generation, the key second generation leaders. Monroe, they play roles, right? But to me, they're not one of the found. Right? Ben Franklin, who we're going to look at in October, he's the grandfather of the fathers, right? Or the parent, if you'd rather have that term, which is totally fine. So but he's one of the youngest ones that's born in. He's born into the lap of luxury, born into wealth and privilege. He was raised to be an aristocrat, something that he denied consistently his entire life, lying fully through his teeth. It's tough for me sometimes because lying is such a strong word, and I recognize it's a strong word. So it's like, are you that blind to your privilege? Maybe that's the way to say it. Are you that deflective because you know it's true but you don't want to talk about it? It's not really certain, but nonetheless, he consistently cast others as the aristocrat trying to do something to destroy the republic while never, ever admitting, look, I live on a mountain in isolation with 200 slaves taking care of all my needs. So, but where did that come from? It's not him, it's the system. By the way, the fact that he's a slaveholder, I say this now, is actually not the reason why I detest the man. It's like the icing on the cake. After I tell you all the stuff that I could tell you, it's like, oh yes, and this. And I say that because, as you know, slavery is alive and well in all 13 colonies. We're going to have a talk with my friend, Professor Mike Salma, I'll show you on the slide, I think it's September, on slavery in the Revolution. What happened for the African American community during the Revolution? So that'll all be a thing that kind of gets covered at that point. I hope you'll come back for that talk as well. His parents were wealthy. His namesake parents were people who made good and came up, which, by the way, would seem to suggest then that you would recognize I came from, not poor, but my family came from regular people background. Ergo, if I do make good, I should, A, own it, and at the same time then be friendly to the lesser man. Probably is why he may have been friendly to the lesser man, because he was friendly to the people like us in the middle class or lower middle class in the process. It's his father who he adored. He becomes a surveyor. This is a very famous map, really the first authoritative map of Virginia at the time in the 18th century. And his father drew it. He's a surveyor. So this is very important. It's interesting, Jefferson's not the kind of person, neither am I, who would be considered a man's man. The kind of rough and tumbly, kind of get out there. He was a man of the mind, a man of writing, as I've already said. And it's interesting because he always adored his father as this man's man. Like his father was, the rugged, picture perfect, man, particularly Virginia man. And his family did good. His mom was from an elite family, the Randolphs. And they had money from the beginning. His maternal grandfather was the third son of these guys who came into Virginia. Now, there's other Randolphs here early, but they're into Virginia 1670s. And his mom was actually born in London. And so a family of great privilege. The Randolphs are very important. If you ever do any Virginia history, you examine that. You'll see the Randolph name repeatedly. Being here a couple of times. He was close to his family. He was raised in their plantation of the Shadwell plantation. His mom ran the place, and she always carried a massive influence in his life, which is, of course, lovely. And so she dominated the society, dominated his world. He was the oldest son, kind of had this responsibility. His father dies when he's 14, so he kind of becomes man of the house, but really at no point does he kind of operate as man of the house because his mother was such a strong woman and a strong leader in her own right, in the ways that many women are. We talked about that last month when we looked at women in the Revolution, how so often it is the woman who is guiding the whole process of the business of the family, and in their case, a very large business within the plantation. But still, raised in luxury. So Shadwell is not one of the big ones. Monticello will be bigger. He'll have more slaves there than they did at Shadwell. So show, again, proof of his success as he goes through his life financially. Or at least in his case, proof of his willingness to live deeper and deeper in debt. That's maybe another way to put it. Because he definitely was one of the, he would be great in America today. Because, you can just have all kinds of appearance in this process. Shadwell, so here's Charlottesville, right? So Shadwell is basically here, and here's eventually where Monticello is, right? So you kind of can see the relationship of this area. Here's Monticello on this map, which is a little more modern, right? The reason this map's on here is because here's Williamsburg. So it's not that far, right, from Richmond and Williamsburg. Williamsburg at this point is the capital of the colony, so not Richmond. So this is where he's going to go to school. He's going to go to William and Mary, 1760. It's at William and Mary that he has the influence of three critical men in his life. One was his professor. I hope sometimes, I think I do from time to time, have this influence in the lives of young students. Dr. William Small. He's from Scotland. He brings the Scottish Enlightenment. The Scottish Enlightenment is a huge impact to the American. Don't say the Enlightenment is a huge impact, because that's not really accurate. The Scottish Enlightenment, the non-European side, although Montesquieu is important, the non-European side, the Scottish Enlightenment, that's the one that really matters, really has a big influence. And so Small's an example of that. He really taught mathematics, but he really taught Jefferson how to think. He taught him about thinking. And if you want to look and see, like, well, why was maybe Jefferson not as entrenched religiously as others? I'd say Small's a key influence in that way in his life. The governor at that time, Farquhar, was someone who brought him in. He found in Jefferson, and as a professor, I've been here, you kind of just see a student and you're like, I like this kid. There's something about the student, some kind of brilliance that they show, some kind of vitality to learning and interest, and they just gravitate. You kind of want to help. I want to help all my students, but still there's a sense where you're like, there's something about this kid. I want to help this person, right? And I've had the privilege of being in that spot as the student myself. And so the governor brought him in, and it's through the governor that he met George Wythe, who in one sense taught Jefferson to love luxury. So as I said, Jefferson will go through his entire life as a man of very good taste. He loved really expensive things. And again, here's the inconsistency. Maybe inconsistency is better than the lying word, but he will complain his entire life about being in debt, and yet his entire life spend more money than he made. He's like, dude, you're in debt for one good reason. So how about stop spending? Are you kidding me? This wine's amazing. So he's all in, right? He became a wonderful violinist, loved having high artistic stuff. When he's in Paris, which we won't get to, he's constantly buying stuff, sending them back. It's always, again, a juxtaposition for me because of how John and Abigail chose to live, like within their means. It's kind of a novel concept. Maybe only spend as much money as you make. It's an idea. It's just a thought, right? So these three men, though, will be crucial to kind of shaping his worldview. We're all, most of us at least, I'll say I, am shaped by the people who I knew as a young person, right? And there's a handful of people that really became very important in my life. And sometimes when you look back now, my age in my 60s, you look back and you're like, yeah, that reflects him or her or that person that really made a difference in my life. He loved all about being in college. That's probably why I'm a professor, because I love being all about things in college, so I just love it. It's a lot of fun to me. He loved to study. Again, those of you who know how much I don't like him, you know how much I love this quote. By the way, all the quotes are pretty much his. If they're not, I'll try to point them out to you. So these are his words. Because he said, look, you need to study, and sorry, Joel, you need to study history. You need to study history. That's what you need to study. Again, Small was his math professor, but still he's saying history and then philosophy and poetry. When was the last time you heard a college saying we're going to make sure we're going to have poetry classes for our students? That could be beneficial. He loved to play. He loved to enjoy the recreational time of life. And he loved women. Nothing wrong with that. And he had many loves. The first one, Miss Burwell here. Miss Burwell gives us a good example, though, into something about him. I already told you he's kind of like this principled writer. He's a writer. At this point, he doesn't really know this fact, but before long, he'll be a person for whom he recognizes, I'm not the speaker that, for instance, Patrick Henry is. I'm a good writer. And this first comes to his own mind and his own diaries where he kind of talks about this because he wants to marry Miss Burwell, and he tries to ask her. And by his own admission, he basically goes in for the ask and then and tongue-tied, total fearful as someone who asked his wife to marry him. I know the feeling. I hope this goes well. And so, it just didn't work out. She turned him down. Another week later, she was engaged to somebody else, which I know you may go, what? But that's still kind of how the way they did things back then. And so he loved this life in the college. And because the capital's there, it's his first foray into the governing process, right? So he met and got to know Patrick Henry. And Henry is about 7 years older than him. In 65, Henry is elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, their legislative body, right? And so on his very first move in, Patrick Henry, seemingly from what we can tell from what Jefferson said, invites him to come. You should come see. He's like my first go. You may know in legislative circles, usually the first person, you're a freshman, your first time in, you just got elected, there's some kind of maiden speech that you make at some point, this kind of a thing. Henry picked the moment of the Stamp Act crisis as his moment to kind of come out and say, well, here's what's going on. And instead of just making some somewhat neutral speech about whatever, to say, hi, man, Patrick, I hope I'm your friend later, he comes in guns blazing with his view, and he suggests that there should be 5 resolutions passed about what they should say back to London to oppose the Stamp Act. All right? And they're very provocative in the process. And the 5th one is the one that really gets him in trouble because he goes and says openly, this is Patrick Henry now, that the General Assembly of this colony hath the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes. Now, as we talked about in April, and you may have seen before, this is really where you start getting into the mix of this thing we call the American Revolution, right? And as I've described many times, and did it here in April, a good way to understand the American Revolution is that it is 2 groups of people failing to communicate. They are talking past each other. And there's a way in which you can stand with the British, or you can stand with the Americans, and you go, oh, I see, yeah, you're right. And you come over here and you're like, oh, wait, y'all are wrong, y'all are right. And we're not, or I'm not, trying to say which one of these views you should hold. But as a good historian, we want to try to put all this information on the table and kind of understand, where they're coming from. So we talked about why the British were doing this, but this statement by Henry is an example, and it barely passes. It's an example of how the Americans, or at least a group of the Americans, were like, that's not cool, you can't do that. The only power of taxation comes through us. Now, this goes back to the British Bill of Rights, so their version of a constitution. They don't have a written constitution, but their version of a constitution. And in that idea, the talking is about, as they will say here, no taxation without representation. And we talked about in April how that statement is false. They had representation. And I don't mean just virtual representation. They had physical representation. Ben Franklin and others were in London. They met with the prime minister. They said, that's a great plan. And then they realized how wrong they were as Ben Franklin's house almost got burned down. Like, oh, well, that's the wrong move. And like a good politician, Ben Franklin completely went a 180 and went back to the prime minister. That's a terrible plan. The prime minister's like, dude, you can't get off on Franklin. We're gonna dig into this when we get to the talk on Franklin. And so the Americans are trying to make a positional statement, at least those who are on the side saying we must not rebel. Nobody's saying rebel. Sam Adams was probably saying we should rebel, but nobody else is, including Patrick Henry. He's not saying we should rebel. He's just saying that, look, we need to argue this point. And this is the point very famously for Patrick Henry, where he's accused of treason. And so then Henry goes, look, if it's treason, make the most of it, because I am trying to make a point about our dying liberty. Now, he says his concern is about the country. We want to point out here again, we've seen this multiple times when you look at the Revolutionary time period. When you hear them talking about my native soil, my country, they never use the word nation, that's a later word. They're talking about their colony. So my country's liberty is not the United States, not the Americans, Virginia. Only Virginia, right? So just you should keep that in your mind. It passes by one vote. Now I want to say that because we're going to see this repeatedly in this story, because it just makes this point I've made before. To call what we go through from 75 to 83 or 63 to 83, the American Revolution is of course an American perspective. It's the way I say it. But what it really is, it's the first American Civil War. The thing we do in 1861 is our second Civil War, because this was the first Civil War. Because all the way through until you get to Yorktown, and then even after Yorktown, you have a varied percentage of Americans, so British citizens living in North America, whose position is, I love my government, I'm in the freest, most liberal, progressive government in the world. Why would I ever want to leave that? Y'all are a bunch of crazy freaks. And Patrick Henry and Sam Adams and eventually John Adams and George Washington have to answer them. And the battles that occur, there's more regiments of loyalists raised up than there are of, Sons of Liberty, American militia. Not more troops necessarily, but there's a lot of people who take up arms to defend their government. And so here in Virginia, and again, if you think about the Revolution at large, you typically would know, particularly if you know somebody from Virginia or Massachusetts, that they argue with each other over who was first or who's most important, Massachusetts or Virginia. So we're not talking about Georgia. We're not talking about North Carolina here. We're talking about Virginia. So in my sixth grade understanding, Virginia would be 100% behind Patrick Henry, except for one or two loser loyalists. They're a bunch of losers. No. And in fact, Peyton Randolph, who will become a leader in the rebellion when you get to 76, at this point, walks past his cousin and says, I would have given anything to have one vote, meaning to stop at least that fifth resolution. Now, all Jefferson's doing is watching. So he's learning. One, he's learning the power of the oratory. And I think he's already recognizing, I don't have that. But then he sticks around. What's interesting is Patrick Henry left that day and went out and went away. So we won. But the legislature didn't stop meeting. And so Randolph and the others who had opposed the fifth resolution came back the next day, had it struck in defeat on a technicality, parliamentary technicality. If you've ever done anything with Robert's Rules of Orders or legislative groups, you know it's not over till it's over. Right? There's always ways to make things happen and bring things back up. Jefferson saw all of this. And so if you know Jefferson, and we won't look at this today, but if you know Jefferson in his kind of legislative stance, once we get to the Republic, so in the Washington administration and then forward, there's a sense in which all of why he ends up looking this way or acting the way he acts, to me, maybe not all, but much, is because of what he learned here. He recognized, and I'll put it in terms, the fact that Hamilton won that round does not mean that he's going to win the long-term journey. I'm going to do what I can do to win. And so he gets that here. It's also interesting here, because this is the first moment in which this ties into his love of words, I would say, is that he begins to learn about the power of the press. So the governor, his friend, ordered the Virginia Gazette to not publish any of these. Now, they did get published. In fact, there were more than 5 that got published, and somehow there ended up being a 6th, 7th, and an 8th written in different places. So if you Google it, you'll find more than the 5. So you have to kind of look for Henry's original 5. But to the next year, to kind of defy the governor, his friend, and to, he would have said, help have a more free press, Jefferson supported the start of a new newspaper. Now again, when you get to Jefferson and the Washington administration, having this as a background information is like, oh, I see it. So he was always someone who recognized you could spin the power of people if you could control the words that were being said. All right? Everybody good? Okay. Now, there's a period now, remember he's young, where he's really just kind of starting his life. He's a lawyer. He goes and travels north for the first time, doesn't like it, comes back to Virginia. He studies under George Wythe, his friend, so he's kind of learning about being a lawyer. He's trying to find a wife. There's a moment when he's kind of close to maybe trying to break up a marriage and have another wife, and it's not really clear if it's her fault or his fault. He was, by all accounts, very handsome. Abigail Adams talked about how handsome he was. John Adams, not handsome. Adam. So there's this moment where he's kind of moving through, having this journey, and then he, in 68, gets elected. So this is the name here in the newspaper. He's elected for Albemarle County to the House of Burgesses. It's awesome. I will point out to you, most of the time when you get back to this time period, the people who are getting elected are the people of wealth and privilege. And it's not like there's more of us in the room today than there would have been possible candidates for the whole of Virginia. So 90% of you would have been in the House of Burgesses, and a few of you, like me, might have lost the election, but in general, you all would have been there. The numbers are just smaller. That's not to take anything away from him or from Washington, who's here, or any of the other. And there's Mr. Pendleton, who becomes later important. I'm not taking anything away from these people, just pointing out that you always have to keep in mind, sort of like when you hear about like James Madison, they go to school at like 16, they're going to college. Wow, that's smart. I would say Madison, yes, but often it's like, no, there just wasn't high school, that's just where you went. I mean, you either went to work at 15 and did stuff, or you might have been privileged like John Adams or Madison or those guys to get to go off to a college in the process. But he does get to go to the House of Burgesses. And so right at the start, we see this thing that's going to be a trend for him, is that he's the person who gets to write. So there's a new governor, so he gets to write the welcoming address. Then the Townsend Acts happen in 67, so in 69 they're going to write something, and they're going to basically set up a non-importation, which is a fancy word for saying a boycott, which I'll show you more about that in just a second in the process. Jefferson's the one who ends up writing the remonstration, saying, hey, we don't like this, it's not the way we should do things. Remember, the Townsend Acts were the Stamp Act was meant to be like we would call it almost like a sales tax. It kind of just everywhere, right? It just kind of covers everything. And then they backed down because everybody freaked out, started burning people's houses down. There's a moment when and so Franklin gets put on trial by Parliament, and they're like, you said it was fine. And he's like, oh, well, and they go through this quibbling about taxes, types of taxes. And so one of them says, so what's the problem? He goes, well, that was an indirect tax, like our sales taxes are indirect, right? And they go, so the direct tax? So no, we have no problem with the previous taxes that were passed. So the new government that comes in calls his bluff. He says, okay. And so they put a tax on everything. And so they taxed literally everything in the process. So then the only way to beat that was to try to cause financial harm to the merchants in London so that they will elect different people. We do that same kind of thing today, both domestically and internationally in the process. But I want you to see this, because we're not going to read all this, but this is what's in there, right? Look at this list of things. So these things, so here's what's taxed. They're saying, hey, we're not going to do the taxing thing. I mean, we're not going to buy the stuff that's taxed. And oh, by the way, we're just not going to pay all this stuff either. We're not buying any of this stuff. And if you were here last month, we looked at the women in the revolution. We talked about how they became the leaders in battling through the non-importation situation. They really went for it. We're going to not buy anything. Now, at this point in 69, it's still state to state, and it's uneven relative to who's this. So this is Virginia. Relatively uneven, so keep that in mind as we get closer to the First Continental Congress. Okay, this is when he buys Monticello. And so he's looking for land. It's close, so he showed you on the other map, it's close to Shadwell. This is the earliest photo that we know that we have of it at the time of the American Civil War. We're lucky that it's there because he gets so far in debt that his family has to sell everything, including it, and so it's not torn down.
Sorry, can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
Going back to the previous screen.
Yeah.
The word America, it's probably semantics, but you said a few minutes ago they never used the word nation.
Right.
Does this...
So they would have used this term as a way to describe the 13 colonies. So we're opposing the act of Parliament that the act's name was the purpose of raising revenue in America.
I just was curious.
Yeah, so the term America is used a lot,
Okay.
which is really interesting. Just as a sidebar, if you've paid attention, in I'd say the past 20 years, there's often a discussion about whether you should say you're from America or from the United States. We won't go down that road, although I think my pen that I have on today is, I think it says United States. But
Sorry,
back and forth, no, you're good. Back and forth on the America, USA thing, because obviously there's a lot of America, two halves, right? And so to say you're from America is kind of like, well, which one? But in our arrogance, we all know which one. But it is interesting. At that time, they would have called it America first in the way that they described it. And the they mean, remember, at this point, the best way to be thinking is that everybody we're talking about, from King George to Thomas Jefferson, are British citizens. So they don't mean America as distinct from Britain. They mean it as locationally. Like, you don't live in York, you don't live in Southampton, you live in America. So you're just a part of our entity,
Okay.
is the way that they would look at it.
Understood.
Yeah. Unfortunately for him, Shadwell burns down. It's really tragic when it does, obviously. Nobody died. His mom was gone. They were all away. And so they basically moved everybody to Monticello. At that time, it's just like one room. And so they begin this process of moving. He's still not married at this point, but he'll take care of that. Here's Monticello. There's Charlottesville. He's kind of turned differently in the process because here's Monticello and here's Charlottesville. He marries a widow. I will call her Martha most of the time. Sometimes she's known as Patty. I think people do that in Revolutionary writing because everybody knows Martha Washington and they don't want to confuse people. But it was Martha. The man she had married was in his, I believe, his third marriage, Bathurst Skelton. Wasn't necessarily a good man, wasn't a horrible man, but he got some baggage. He dies in 68, so she's a widow. We think Jefferson met her in 70, but for sure they started dating in 71. And it's through the Skelton family that we come to Miss Hemings. Her mother, Elizabeth Hemings, was the mistress to John Wales. And so she, Sally, is the half-sister of Martha. John Wales was, these two are together, and from them, they get to here. I'm not saying that very well. As I'm looking at my own slide, I'm going, wait, I'm confusing myself. I will just say at this point, the storyline with Jefferson and Hemings is a later down the chronology story. So I don't say that to dismiss the importance. It's a very, very major thing here to have a conversation about. But it really comes to fruition when he gets to Paris, and then he has his daughters come to Paris, and Sally comes with her as her personal servant. And at that point, Sally is somewhere between 14 or 15, and becomes a romantic interaction. Romantic is probably not the right word, but yeah, a sexual interaction between Jefferson and Hemings. And for most of us, that's very problematic for a variety of reasons. I think good reasons, kind of a thing. I'll just say for this talk today, we need to sort of just set that over there, knowing that this is where she gets into the story. Because what will happen is, when Peter Jefferson dies, there will be his when Martha's father, John, dies, I'll get it right in a minute. When you die, you pass your things down. At that time, unfortunately, part of your things were other humans. And so they got passed down as, here's a bunch of books, and here's some wagons, and here's some people. And hopefully that's horrific to all of you, but nonetheless, it's the story we have to kind of look back to without shading it or trying to color it one way or the other. And so it's interesting at this point, they were in debt. Martha's father was in debt. So they sold all the slaves except the Hemings because of the interrelationship. I'll just say for myself, examining the life of slaves in the period up through the Civil War is a very complex and complicated interaction that deserves a tremendous amount of care as you navigate through. It's easy to, in my opinion, to run off into trite or cute phrases that either minimizes or maximizes in a way that's inconsistent with the historical evidence that we have. So, now again, there's a lot that's been written on the Hemings aspect of Jefferson. There's not a lot that's been written on Jefferson, mostly because most people have discovered, like I have, not a good guy. There is some recent stuff you can read, but the research on him is very weak in the last 20 years, I think because of some of the things that have come to light. But the Hemings family and researchers within the Hemings family have done a tremendous amount of research. So if you're interested in going down that aspect to get her side, we have a lot of her side through her children who recorded and did the work of historians in the early 19th century of writing, here's the things our mother told us. Here's the things we saw. 4 of Thomas's and Sally's 6 children will live to adulthood. And so there's a lot that's written in that journey. Okay, everybody good? Okay, let's go on. Now, this is the time, so this period is we're moving to 76 for the crisis. We're getting into this place where it's coming, it's building, right? And one of the things that's important that we talk about, or we've talked about before, is how different Britain handled its colonies abroad. And the way I've said it is that in one sense, when you go back to the early part of the 18th century, it's kind of like, yeah, we've got some colonies, and I don't know, a few families live there. 100 people, 1,000 maybe? And then they fight the French and Indian War. Actually, they fight the 4 colonial wars, but the French and Indian War in particular, where they bring troops over. So British people come over, fight, leave, go home. And much like we're having right now, if you're paying attention on social media with FIFA, people coming over and never been here are like, oh my gosh, look at that. I didn't know this. Everybody's so nice. Bucky's huge. I know the food's amazing. Have you had biscuits and gravy? I didn't know that even existed. You can get free refills on drinks. That's our shining star if you've not been paying attention to social media. Everybody's freaking out. And ice. If you've ever traveled to Europe, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, and I love going to Europe, so it's not a dig. It's just kind of go knowing there's no free refills. No, you can buy another one. It's cracking me up how they're all in on this thing. So they didn't understand, and then the war happens, they're like, oh, there's actually several 100,000 of you. Y'all need to pay your taxes. Because we were paying no taxes. Citizens of Britain not paying any taxes at all. And so they're like, well, that's not fair. So there's that whole conversation we've had before. And so this is called collectively salutary neglect. It's a fancy way of just saying they weren't paying attention because they didn't really need to. And then they started to. So looking at Virginia, though, we can see kind of what this becomes because you've got this situation where you go from no suspensions to 75 in 9 years. Meaning, in general, the governor just said, yeah, do whatever you want to do. It doesn't matter. We don't care. Not getting any guidance from Parliament to try and stop you. So, yeah, whatever. Do your thing. You know? And now, all of a sudden, the government's like, hey, look, yeah, we have some ideas. We need to do this, that, and the other. And I would just say, from Britain's point of view, there was no conspiratorial thought in 63, let's control those people. It was just like, hey, pay your fair share. And then when we didn't like it, it then led to a series of events that we talked about before, kind of dominoes hitting one after the other, that have led to an increasingly more and more strident and aggressive response to each other, right? The 2 different groups. So you can see this feeling of this control. And in Virginia in particular, a lot of this gets back to money. Jefferson and the Jeffersons were not the only ones deep in debt. And so there's a way, unlike Massachusetts, when you look at the revolution in Virginia, you're really looking at a revolution of the elite. And if you kind of dig in, like, well, what are they mad about? Arguably, they're mad because they're in debt. They're in debt because their agrarian economy was always connected to the whims and ups and downs of the harvest. And so then that was always needing to be lent into with the economic system of the time through banks and bankers. So quite naturally, they were taking loans and then paying them off, and then taking new loans and paying them off. And of course, they're all living the life of luxury and plantations. None of them are living like John and Abigail, moderate within their means, because we have to look, well, you know, we're buying, we have a bunch of stuff to buy. That kind of a thing, right? So then you get this, you read Washington's diaries. This is one reason why he diversifies at Mount Vernon. He's one of the first planters to say, you know what, I need to get away from my agrarian economy because I'm so annoyed that I'm always in debt and they're always wanting to get paid back. I'm like, George, that's what Citibank does to me. When they want to be paid back, it's shocking how that works out. But he's frustrated by the whole process. So this is important here, though, because then the Virginian leaders are recognizing, we've got to find a way to make sure the middle and poor class get involved with this story, because they don't care. They're not involved with us in this situation. So the T Act gives the opportunity for that. We've covered this before. You know, in 73, the government tries to do something, not really to have anything to do with us. The T Act's all about saving the East India Tea Company. It's all about they're in financial trouble. How can we help them? They remove a tax. There's 2 taxes on tea. They remove one of them. They keep the one in America. Some people in Parliament are like, we should flip that around so the Americans think they're getting away with no taxes. They lower the cost of tea, freaks everybody out. Everybody gets mad. Tea Act. All up and down the eastern seaboard, you got ports where either captains are held basically at gunpoint, or they block the harbor, you can't come in here, or like in Boston, they get on the boats and throw the tea over. And remember, we said this before, for us, a lot of times we're like, tea, big deal, what's the freaking out moment, come on. You know, the tea was owned by the king, so to attack something of the king is to attack the king himself. It's like the linkage to the whole Robin Hood story. You know, they're hunting for deer where? In the royal forest. Well, the king's hundreds of miles away. What does he care? It doesn't matter. It's his deer you just killed. So you can't take it. You stole him from the king. That kind of thing. That's lost on most of us, hopefully. You go, well, I don't do the king thing. I don't understand what's happening there. But nonetheless, the response from the government to this act was narrow, moderate, and limited. And it infuriated the entire eastern seaboard. So it shows you how far off the government is in recognizing where this problem is or how frustrated people are. They did a very narrow thing aimed at the troublemakers. And the rest of the colonies took it as a personal affront. So you get this in Virginia because they respond. So here's where Virginia leaders, and Jefferson's not the leaders at this point, but he's in the small group. You know, he's in the room where it's happening. And he's having the conversation. And so they decide, the people will not really understand this. We need to reach the people. How can we do that best? Let's ask for a day of fasting, general fasting and prayer. That would be the most appointment of a day to do what? Call up and alarm attention. Of who? Well, everybody, because everybody goes to church. That's the idea that Jefferson and the group has. So this is their way of helping awake all the other people that there's a problem from the Virginia elite point of view because of how the British are acting. Does that make sense for everybody? I don't want to lose you here. It's a brilliant move. It's not, and again, this is not a slam on Jefferson, because there's a lot of people who claim to be religious and they don't ever act like it. It's not like he's playing fast and loose. He's just thinking politically. Really, in one sense, Jefferson to me is our first real politician. So if you're like me, you don't like politicians, now you know part of why I don't like it. But hey, he's joined by Hamilton, right? And Mr. Madison plays a role in there, but everybody likes to blame Madison. I don't blame Madison, because Madison is just Jefferson's boy. And so Jefferson's the guilty party. He's the one who's doing the leading in this. And so he's thinking like a politician. I need to get the people behind me. We'll call for a day of fasting and prayer. And as you can see, in July, it gets enacted. Everybody's all in on it. Everybody's excited about it. And so they're getting this momentum building, which leads to what's known as the First Virginia Convention, right? So the new governor, so this is the third governor we've seen, is Lord Dunmore. He does not like this call for the fasting. It's an opposition to the Coercive Acts. So we're in 74. So he dissolves the House, like we saw other things, either stopping, you can't pass that, or we're just going to say you can't meet anymore. So they begin to meet in secret. And at this point, you could say in Virginia, you have kind of, like we will talk about in some places when you look at kind of nations in rebellion and revolutions, a shadow government, where the real government are these elected officials who are meeting, but they're meeting in secret because the official government power lies with the governor. And so this time they're going to call for a new importation act. Again, Washington's one of the leaders in making this happen. Let's try to attack them economically. And here's where they will elect representatives to the First Continental Congress. So a bunch of famous names. One of the reasons why I like showing you all these names is oftentimes what I do in my class after we've covered the Revolution is we have a day where we talk about, so we've won, but will we make it? You have to imagine it's not 2026, and of course we're all sitting here. It's like, well, in 1783, what's our likelihood of making it? And there's lots of ways to look at it, but one of the points that we kind of show them is that the strengths of our revolution, which I would argue is unique in human history, is the sheer depth of brilliance in the revolutionary generation. And when you look at what I would say the kids like John Quincy Adams and Madison, you can see this brilliance continuing to be there, right? And my point of that is, you know his name, and you may know, probably know Patrick's name. You don't typically walk in here knowing Peyton Randolph. You don't know Richard Henry Lee, although you're going to meet him. And these other guys, like, who are these people? And you realize, and Jefferson's not one of them, right? So we know this upper crust of our elite leaders who do the cool things that we record in history. And then even at the First Continental Congress, there's names you don't know. And then you realize there's a longer list in Virginia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, elsewhere, where these people that never leave the state level. I've often said you could kill everybody but Washington and Adams and you'd still win. Because the brilliance throughout is so deep. How we got that, as one historian called constellation of leaders, hard to say, but still it's a factor for who we are in a revolution. So, in the moment of this non-importation, just one little dig at Jefferson that I'd like to point out here, which I think is consistent with his inconsistency, to just show you something about the man. He's there when they passed the Non-Importation Act, and he's there when he made an order on that version of Amazon for things from London. And then he gets called on it, and then in typical Jeffersonian fashion, he like starts monkeying around with the writing and stuff and making this very elaborate and laborious argument about, the dates and this and that and this and that. It's a picture of who Jefferson is to me. There's a tremendous amount of inconsistency in here. And so you've got this picture of this moment where he should be either canceling the order, but no, he takes it because he was trying to build Monticello, and these are the best windows he can get. They're coming from London, so I'm taking those. I need the high cost of luxury. Forget the Non-Importation Act. I don't really care. So I just needed to show you this. Okay, it's at this moment, so the group's going off to the First Continental Congress, that he then takes his pen to make the most elite thing he can write. And it's really his cotillion. It's his coming out moment nationally, which he writes a summary view. And what he's writing here is he's not requested to do this. He does it on his own, which is fine, of course, to write and say, what is it that is we're mad about? Why are we meeting in this Congress? It's wildly historically inaccurate, but it matches the American mindset, meaning everybody reading it at the time would have been like, yeah, he's exactly right. And it's brilliantly written because it's Jefferson. It goes into the emotional and psychological depth of kind of what's going on. It's very successful. And he thought when he wrote it, he said, I thought I would give instruction to the delegates, meaning I'm not going, but let me try to put into words what we've all been saying about what's going on. So he's kind of working his way through that process. And so he writes that. He lays out this kind of argument. And the argument starts with the fact that Parliament does not have power over us. Now, this is at the central part of the argument that's been going on with the revolution itself. The American Revolution, some of you have been here before. What's the American Revolution about? Remember? One word? Control. The American Revolution is about control. It's not about money, it's not about taxes, it's not about trade. Those things are secondary. It's about control. Who's in charge? The Americans are like, we want to be in charge. Which is fair enough, that's fine. The British are like, no, we started. So now they have to make an argument to say, why can we be in charge, right? So he's basically pointing out, for instance, that the colonies, this is historically inaccurate, were created at the expense of individuals and not of the British public, meaning the government had nothing to do with it. Now that might have been true for the Mayflower, but it's the only group it would have been true for. The only group. And when you read the Mayflower Compact, as we have in here before, first line, devotion to the monarch. So we're not coming to create our own nation, we're not coming to do our own thing. We just want to have a religious freedom to do something. But we're happy to be subject to the crown. Right? So completely wrong on that. And he's like, look, we were over here by independent individuals. So again, he as all of them do, tie this back to the British Declaration of Rights. So this is important. So if you really want to understand the American Revolution, between now and July 4th, go Google the British Bill of Rights, 1689, and read it. We've done it in here. And when you read it, you'll go, oh my gosh, like almost half of our Bill of Rights is connected to that. And you'll see all these themes that not only govern or kind of talk to our governing thought process, but they undergird the entire viewpoint of what the rebellers were doing, what they were saying. They're saying, look, we have rights that are from this government, and they are betraying those rights. Right? Does that make sense? Now that becomes the argument, which we'll look at next week or next month when we do the declaration, is were they betraying those rights? It's a whole different conversation. Right now we're just saying that's what the Americans are saying, because that's what they're saying. And he goes on, he says, look, there's kind of a coordinated thing happening here. Now notice who he's blaming. He's blaming the British Parliament. If you come back in July, and if you don't, when you read the declaration, as you should know, is a deep takedown of the king. Well, who's the draftsman? Jefferson. So Jefferson in 76. What do you think about the king, Tom? Hate him. Jefferson in 74. What do you think about the king? He's innocent. So you got to really dig into what happens over those 2 years to kind of make this move. He makes the completely historically inaccurate comment, and he's going to make this argument, tries to make this argument in the Declaration, that the British are the reason we have slavery. We had nothing to do with it. We're just stuck with it. Which, of course, then any thinking person goes, oh, I'm so sorry, Tom. Well, you should just get rid of your slaves. It's a pretty easy decision to make. Oh, I can't do that. Now, he's not alone in that. That's what everybody else. Remember, where's slavery? Which state? All 13. All right, so again, don't think South. Don't think Civil War. Don't think that stuff. Not yet. It's all 13. Blame all 13. Don't blame the South alone in that process. And then he makes, again, an historically inaccurate statement, but he says, look, you've got troops here without permissions in defiance of the law. Which law? The British document of Declaration of Rights. But you have to walk through the whole journey from the French-Indian War, in which case you learn that the British sent troops, and I hope the movie Young Washington shows it. I'm going to go see it. I'm going to go on July 4th. I'm hoping it does its job. It says, we have troops over here because the 13 colonies begged and moaned for 70 years, send us troops to defend us. Why should we do that? Because we are your citizens. Well, dude, which is it? Are you our citizens or are we hateful? You see the problem here, right? You can kind of see where this tension's coming from. So it's not without defiance of law. It's not that at all. But I want you to see this. I'm not going to read it to you. This is where he concludes. Who's he write to? The king. What is he writing to the king? Please help us. So he in 74, like most people in America, perceived the monarch as our, if not our friend, neutral. And of course, it's your ministers who are the ones doing what? Causing the problems. And he says, look, we don't want to separate from her. Who's her? Meaning our government, basically. But the God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. And the hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them. Meaning we'll fight you on this if we have to. But look where he ends it. You need to work to stop Parliament so that you can quiet the minds of your subjects in British America. Who? Subjects. When you get to the Declaration, he's going to say something different. 74. This is 74 in British America against any apprehensions of further encroachment on our liberty, basically. That's what he's trying to get to. This was a massive bombshell writing. It's arguably the most strident writing at this point of any of the revolutionary authors. And there's lots of people, many of whom we don't really even spend time talking about who they are, who are writing editorials and letters and pamphlets. And in fact, it's so shocking that some are like, I don't think I like that. It's a little too much, Tom. You're just a young man. You should just cool your jets a little bit. That kind of a thing. He made 2 copies, and he sent it. He was going to hand deliver it, and then he got ill along the way, had one of his slaves take it the rest of the way, to his cousin Peyton and to Patrick Henry. When Randolph gets his copy, he has a gathering of members from the secret House of Burgesses that are meeting, and he has it read aloud. At the meeting is a husband-wife team, Clementina and William Rind, who are publishers. Jefferson knew nothing about this. He wasn't doing this for fame or fortune. And Clementina makes sure it's published. So she publishes it, and it starts spreading abroad. Washington, on his way to Philadelphia, will buy copies to take with him and hand out to the members of the First Continental Congress. As you can see, by 75, copies being printed in London. And when he goes to the Second Continental Congress, which we'll see in just a few moments, one of the representatives said in his own diary, "Oh, today I saw the famous Mr. Jefferson." Well, why was he famous? Because of that writing. The summary view is one of the best, if not the best, expressions of the American mind about the Revolution, and it's Jefferson's massive coming out part. When historians do something, they're constantly thinking in terms of the counterfactual, the what if. What is this other thing that happened? It's a way to kind of explore the moment you're looking at, right? And so along the way, as we're going to see, there's several moments when we could have had a storyline that Jefferson is not involved in by his own choices. And instead, these are the moments you look at these, you're like, that's the thing that really links him in. When John Adams meets Jefferson, and they begin having private conversations, and John realizes he's met somebody who is his equal in brilliant mind approach to things. He knows summary view. And so then when it comes time for the declaration, it should not be a shock that they're all going, "Here, Tom, you get the pen. You need to be the person who writes, because the rest of us, we can't compare to you, my friend." So he gets it out there. Now, first Congress meets. Again, Jefferson's not there. In its meeting, we talked about this previously, in Massachusetts, there was a similar strident statement known as the Suffolk Resolves. They basically had the same sort of throw down the gauntlet, we're going to have to go to war if necessary kind of moment. And they passed that, they support that in the process. Then on October 14th, they passed their first declaration. Technically, the Stamp Act Declaration is the first declaration in the American story here. But they passed the Declaration of Resolves. It is again a repeat of all the things that have been gone through. It is again a statement to the king saying, "Hey, please rescue us because the parliament sucks and they're causing all the problems. Your ministers have led us to this crisis in the process." And they boil that thing up and they send it on its way. They did also include an argument, they called for a nationwide, we talked about previously that importation was disparate in how it got worked out. They wanted a nationwide one to be more strident, and even with enforcement. So now they were beginning to come to a governing system of sorts to say, we will enforce this. So if you're a loyalist and you try to do normal trade, if Publix has been banned, if Aldi's been banned, and you start going anyway, we'll know you're one of them. Process. They'll do a whole bunch of other things connected to governance, at least early types of governance, and then they will call for the 13 colonies to help us create an army, basically. Because we think it's going to go down that way. They will replan, they'll give it time. It's usually at this time of year about a 2.5 month journey to England. So you got to give about 5 months for time to get there and get back. Hopefully we get a letter back with George going, "Gosh, I didn't know. I'll fix it for you." They're not going to get anything. They're going to silence on the way back. So in the meantime, he goes back to Virginia. And he's in what's called the Second Virginia Convention, in which they're basically, he doesn't go back to Virginia, they come back to Virginia, but he's still there, he's serving. Patrick Henry rolls in to say, "Hey, look, we need to do this thing with the militia." Now I want to point this out to you again, just to make this point relative to this issue of the American Revolution is really our first Civil War, and that you can see, even in Virginia, the depth of division amongst people. Now, this convention is a group of men, leaders, elected, meeting in secret, because they're basically already at odds with the government. That's who's meeting, okay? So Patrick Henry calls in. This is this very famous moment when he says, "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Because he's saying, look, we need to have this army strengthened to defend the colonies. He's opposed in the room. There's no reason to do this. There's no reason to go down that road. This is going to be provocative. And they're arguing, and Henry's like, "I don't care if it seems provocative. We have to take these stances." Here you see Jefferson, how much, again, he loves the fact that somebody like Henry has this ability to be so eloquent, because his speech was impressive and sublime beyond what can be imagined. The resolution passes, but look how tight it is. Again, if I told you they had a resolution in Virginia in 75 to defend itself, you would have thought it'd be like 125-0, or maybe 120-5 with 5 losers who were secretly there as loyalists giving information to Dunmore. So this is not 65. I just want you to feel this tension. I know I would say over the past 20 years, there's been consistent concern in the country now of, oh my gosh, we hate each other, and political parties stink, and there's all this division, and Dude, it's not our first rodeo. This is what we do. In fact, the thing you should be worried about is if you find a moment when we're all suddenly somehow on the same page. That's the moment to be like, ooh, hang on a second, how did that happen? That's a little nerve-wracking. If you had brought loyalists in the room, it would have been defeated. So again, I just want to stress to you, there's really nobody here who would be an out-and-out loyalist. This meeting is a meeting in secret. They're already, kind of on the bad, naughty list for the governor reporting back to the king. And yet they're going, well, don't think we should do this. Now, Dunmore then makes a decision to try to help his cause, and it will backfire massively. And what he does is he makes a threat against the slave-holding elite who are really leading this charge. He looks at the 60 who lost. So all these people, they're all slaveholders, every one of them. He looks at the 60 and he's like, I can get more on my side if I'll threaten their business model. So that's what he does. It has the 180-degree opposite effect in that people who were on the moderate rebellious side saw this threat to their business model through the attack on slavery, and they're like, oh, I'm going to be over here with Patrick Henry because you're trying to take away our slaves from us. This becomes a really defining moment, and the Dunmore Proclamation will be something which we'll look deeper at when we do slavery in the Revolutionary Year, when we get to that part. I know Mike's going to be looking at that. Now, so what happens? This takes us to the brink. So this takes us back to Boston. I'm going to go really quickly here. If you're here in January, we kind of covered the ground of where we are. Got to move a little quicker than I'm moving. We're going to get there, I promise. All right? So Lexington and Concord. So the British are in charge of Boston. They do the very thing you would kind of want somebody to do if you knew that there were some wild-eyed, crazy people who were trying to blow crap up. You'd want the cops to go find where the guns are being held and get them. And so he tries. It fails one time nicely. The second time it fails bleakly. He also, by the way, has orders to go arrest Hancock, and that's Sam Adams. So he tries. He sends out orders on the night of this 18th, 1775. Hey, go. If they go without military baggage, then the militia is not supposed to be called out. That's what he thinks. When they go, of course, the midnight ride of Paul Revere and all the other people, including some women. They all go riding, right? And they warn everybody. They get to Lexington first. They're all warned. Sam and John Hancock, they ride away safely. When the military gets there, there's 70 militiamen, Minutemen who are there. There's a chatter back and forth. Clear off the road. We're not clear off the road. Blah, 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 blah. Gun went off. To this day, nobody knows who fired first, but this is the shot heard around the world. This is the thing that kicks off the military fighting side of the revolution. This is in the minds of what's happening in the colonists when we go back to Philadelphia with the Second Continental Congress in the process. The British will retreat, and the retreat becomes a rout, and the 12 miles back is just a bloodbath for the British. Don't get lost in these 18th century 19th century numbers, these early numbers with us thinking World War II numbers where there's tens and hundreds of thousands of people fighting. This was a brutal bloodbath for the British. And again, who are the British? They're our soldiers. So now we're really into the Civil War now. It's really on at this point. Boston will be besieged, and this will ultimately lead its way to Bunker Hill and the Washington coming, as we'll see in just a moment. Now, while all that's going on, by the way, let me point out just real quick. This is April 18th. This is April 20th, 22nd. I don't believe Dunmore had word yet of Lexington and Concord. I don't think he does this because of that. He makes this move to move the supplies to British warships. But it is possible by the 22nd he does. I think both of these are in reference to this, not to this. But it's connected that it's all happening in the two major places where we're having these battles, Massachusetts and Virginia. These kinds of things that are happening that are taking people to this place where we're just not going to have reconciliation. The government, meaning in London, they're sending letters to the different colonies, trying to find ways to find reconciliation. The House of Burgess meeting in secret has Jefferson draft the reply, another one of his writing moments. So he writes, with pain and disappointment, we must ultimately declare it, meaning the conciliation only changes the form of oppression without lightening its burden. It passed, what he wrote, only barely, again, the division inside the House, and then he later described it as that the people who voted against it had added a dash of cold water on it here and there, enfeebling it somewhat. Now, in the meantime, and I'm not going to go back, when they were meeting, Peyton Randolph, his cousin, was selected to be, in essence, the governor of Virginia, the leader of the House of Burgesses. So had gone on back to the Second Continental Congress. He comes home. And that's the moment that the House of Burgesses says we need to send somebody, and they choose Thomas Jefferson to go to Philadelphia. So he's not at the First Continental Congress. He's not at the beginning of the Second Continental Congress. He's a replacement. Which, again, knowing the role he ends up playing, it's kind of big, right? So June 11th, he leaves, and he arrives on the 20th. Now, the Second Continental Congress has been dealing with the fact they heard no word back from the king, and Lexington and Concord had happened. So one of their first moves was they created an army, Continental Army. So the U.S. Army is a year older than the nation, if you weren't aware of that. Washington's commander-in-chief goes to Boston. The besiege happened. They had that whole thing happening. This is 75 still. Battle of Bunker Hill happens before Washington gets there. And Jefferson shows up, and the first thing he's asked to do is be a draftsperson. Because they feel, the Second Continental Congress, feel like we need to answer, why have we told the states to build militias? So he works with John Dickinson to write the Declaration for Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms, which, again, he noticed, it's a humble and dutiful petition to the king. So now in 75, Jefferson is still the king, is neutral, he's not our enemy. And they're basically talking about, look, all this stuff has happened in Boston that has led to a sort of warfare. We don't mean to dissolve the union, which has subsisted between us, ... But if you keep pushing, that's kind of the viewpoint that they're taking. That's passed on the 6th, on the 8th. It was passed on the 5th, but on the 8th, they also vote on Dickinson's olive branch petition. So in the St. Continental Congress, Dickinson is one of the most loyal, or he's the most moderate of the people who are at the St. Continental Congress. So he convinced everybody, we need to try one more time. We'll send this, we'll try something else. So they're going to send that off. It's not going to be effective, as we shall see. Meanwhile, there was another reconciliation project that came from Lord North, and guess who's the writer? Thomas Jefferson. So he gets to write this. This time he works with Franklin. And again, it's basically rehashing the same ground for the Americans. The same thing we'd said the previous year. The Declaration resolves that the proposals are inadequate to justice these vaunted terms. And look, you put us in a spot where we must fight to defeat. Who's it coming from? Ministerial, meaning the ministers, prime ministers. It's a parliamentary thing. So even here, who's guilty? The parliament, not the king. Right? This passes July 31st. Now, Jefferson's personal fall, meaning autumn, was bad. It was a bad autumn for him. He loses his daughter. Then his cousin Peyton dies from a massive stroke. Then Dunmore follows through with his threat on the slave thing. So it's not a good fall for Jefferson, while they're, again, waiting to hear something back, maybe, hopefully, from the king on the olive branch petition. He's still in Philadelphia. He goes back and forth a few times, but he's in Philadelphia working. He does one more thing, basically wraps up. Well, he has 2 committees he's on. One, what do we need to finish? 27 separate things. And then there's another one, what do we need to do to create the national governing system? So they're already thinking in 75, we're going to have to write a government of some kind. Like, what are we going to do? So then that process kind of getting there. Now, in February of 76, so January of 76, Thomas Paine's Common Sense comes out. As we talked about in January when it was presented by Professor Zimmer, it's a monumental moment. It is, to me, the moment when people like Jefferson shifted from the king is our neutral friend we can appeal to the king is guilty, because that's the position Paine takes. Remember, Paine's original kind of thought process comes from Benjamin Rush. So it's interesting kind of looking at that linkage between Paine and Rush. And so in February, they find out, look, it's not happening. Now, Jefferson's not there at this point because he's still in Virginia, because Virginia had begun working on a new government. So now there's this conversation going on about what should we write governmentally in the process. The king had opposed this. He gets it in August. He rejects it. He won't read it. Very famously, the minister brought it in on a little platter for him to read, and he's standing there regally in the process. And what we've been told he did was that he takes it, pulls it off the paper, and drops it, and then steps on it. Like, I will not read this. These people. Why? Well, because these people are in open and avowed rebellion. And it's a few people. It's the Hancocks. It's Patrick Henry. It's Sam Adams. These troublemakers have led everybody else astray. And what are they doing? They are traitorously preparing, ordering, and levying war against us. Again, talking past each other. Why do we have a militia? Because you're attacking us. You obviously have a militia because you want to attack us. Can you see it? And so the thing that Jefferson has to write trying to explain why they have a militia is intentional to try to head this off. It's to no effect because at this point, these two parties are so angry with each other, they're just never going to be willing to listen to one another in the midst of what's going on. So October 75, backed up for a second, Parliament opens with a speech from the king in which he says, look, there's a few losers who have led the colonists into their revolt, hostility, and rebellion. And so then in that same October, Parliament passes the Prohibitory Act. So this, as I said, is what arrives in February. John Adams said, look, this is like a declaration of war. The king has told the British fleet, you can stop any American ship that you want. You can capture the ship itself, which is worth money, and its goods, and you can impress the sailors into service in His Majesty's service. So it's our first brush with the impressment that you may know of with the War of 1812 in the process. So while that's going on, Jefferson's at home dealing with some of the issues, worked one through winter, and then his mom dies. His mother, as I told you, was vitally important in his life. And this is one of the moments where he has, some people would suggest the equivalent of a nervous breakdown or a near nervous breakdown. It's worse when his wife dies. And it's obviously understandable if you love your mother or you had a close relationship with your mother, or your mother played a big role like his mother did in the process. And he talked about having basically an onset of massive migraines that made him not inconsolable, but really not effective to work. This is interesting because you know where we're going, Declaration of Independence, right? As the spring is happening, John Adams and others are there in Philadelphia. They're already working. Jefferson's at home. Obviously, we would understand why. But he's not just at home because his mother died. He's at home because Virginia is vital to him. For all of Jefferson's life, there will be a back and forth. And I'll say there's not really as much of a back and forth in that he loves Virginia first, before anything else. Virginia is always first in his mind as he's navigating. May 7th, he decides, okay, I probably should go back. I need to go back. So he does. So while Congress is doing all this stuff, they're responding by having a private, let's basically build a navy. Let's open our ports to other nations. Maybe we'll get France to come and trade with us. And then in May, as we talked about before, John Adams proposes the Declaration Act in the process to say, okay, we need to go for this. So we've covered that ground before, so we're not going to cover it again. But then this is the moment that Jefferson returns. So he arrives on the 14th. The very next day after he arrives back in Virginia, the House of Burgesses sends a note to say, hey, let's go for it. We need to do a full open declaration. So you've got the Congress passing basically a Declaration of Independence. This is why John Adams always believed May should be the time for our fireworks, not July. Because in May, we passed the equivalent of a declaration in which all 13 colonies were asked to take on the rights and standing of, we would use the word nation. There's a whole other conversation about what they meant by that, but to simplify it for you, it is like they were thinking, we will be like the EU is today, right? So you'll be Luxembourg, you'll be Belgium, you'll be France, you'll be England, independent states who have a relationship together, independent nations who have a relationship together, okay? And so in June, Richard Henry Lee, with this information in his background, with John Adams, and so this is the Richard Henry Lee I told you about, that many of you don't know about. It's vitally important in both Virginia and U.S. history. And he and John Adams had become close friends quickly because they both could see the direction we needed to go. So he's like, let's do it. So he puts forth a resolution for the collective to declare an independence. Well, as you might not be surprised, this was controversial. A lot of people didn't like this. Your middle colonies, so Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, they're all like, yeah, we're not doing that. Massachusetts is in, Connecticut's probably in, Rhode Island's certainly in, South Carolina's like, yeah, we're not doing that. So you've got this division, again, even in that moment of the Second Continental Congress, where you would not have had really any true loyalists. They wouldn't have been there. So you see that same division in the process. So they talk about it. June 11th, they vote on it. They pass it, but they postpone a final vote till early July. And in the meantime, they said, we'll set up 3 committees. We've talked about this before. One to work on our foreign policy, one to write the government that we need, and one to write up a declaration saying why. And so that's the group Jefferson's on, and this is the journey that we will cover in July. I promise we will go into all the detail of all this if you've not walked there. I'd love to see you come back. In the end, it passes. It gets printed on the 6th. It's the final vote is the 4th. The only reason the 4th matters is just a weird quirk of unimportant history. It is simply so unimportant. But it's so interesting how it becomes like the monumental date for us. Again, on July 5th, we shouldn't stop talking about the semi-quincentennial because it's not even over. But in any case, you see the point there. Okay, is everybody good? We're not done yet, but I just want to make sure you're good. I promise we're covering this again, or you can, if you can't come back in July, you can obviously read and examine the Declaration itself and Jefferson's role in the process. Okay, it passes. Yay. What does Jefferson do? Well, Jefferson is still embroiled in the midst of this. I hasten to tell you, he shows up in May, works for a couple of weeks, writes the Declaration, which is like, wow, that's pretty impressive, right? And then he's like, I think I want to go home. He's consistently in this tension, and other guys did the same thing. There was a friend of John Adams that he desperately wanted to get into national leadership, who consistently rejected every offer that Adams would try to get it passed for his friend to get this great opportunity. And he and his wife were like, no, yeah, we want to stay here. We love Massachusetts more than not more than we love the United States. I don't think it's fair to say more than the United States because one, the United States doesn't exist. But Jefferson, where is your nation? Virginia is my nation. And he's not alone in that process, right? And, look, he's thinking, my kid's having her 4th birthday. I want to go back. These are my favorite quotes. You already know. It's a painful situation 3 miles from one's country. If you were writing that 300 miles, you'd have to be like in Cuba or in Aruba or maybe over in Mexico if you were writing that. That'd be about 300 miles from Florida. In another nation. If you're 300 miles from here and you're in southern Tennessee, you wouldn't write away from my country. You might complain about being in southern Tennessee, which is where I'm from, and wish you were back in Florida, but you wouldn't suggest you were in another nation. But what Jefferson's writing is really indicative for most. In fact, when you compare his thought process with Adams, who by this point is saying, I have a great zeal for my nation and means the United States, and with George Washington, who will, having served as the Revolutionary General up and down from Virginia to the north, will also take on a USA kind of perspective. I think it actually plays a role into why Jefferson and Washington Adams end up on opposite sides of each other. Right? Because for Jefferson, Virginia is always first, but he's not the only one like that in the process. And you can see it. He's invited to go to France as our ambassador. And he's like, no. Now, his wife was ill. He had just lost his mom. We all know how long that takes to get over, deep tragedy of death. So it's understandable. But I just want you to see this tension. And he's like, look, I'm going home. And Richard Henry Lee calls him out on it. He's like, dude, really? You have a sacred duty. To do what? To serve who? The nation. And Jefferson would be like, my nation's Virginia. And so he wants to go home, and that's where he goes. And so he will again be chosen as a representative in the House of Burgesses as they're going through the war. The war's working its way through. It's interesting at this point because when you think of Jefferson as the president later, and the whole view of his creation of the Republican Party, that Republican Party, the current Republican Party starts with Lincoln, but they use the same name. So that Republican Party, when you look at it, you can get a lot from here because he gets on a 5-man committee to revise all the laws in Virginia. I mean, this could be a whole hour and a half talk to itself, just looking at what they proposed and then what they chose to do. This is when he meets 25-year-old James Madison, because Madison's there now. So, you know, they're looking at some really, we would probably be fair to say progressive ideas, but they're very radically different from even the Virginian perspective. They propose a whole series of them, 126. They don't all pass. To just show you the kind of the strength of this, one, they wanted a penalty if someone doesn't vote. I personally think that's a good idea. He wanted to make basically expand suffrage for all males. Sorry, ladies, he's not going there. He wanted to make immigration easier. You know that's the center of one of our major battles, which if you're paying attention, we've been arguing about this since the 1980s. And now you tell yourself, oh wait, we were arguing about it back then? Yes, we're always arguing about who gets to come and who shouldn't come and what do you do with that whole conversation. He wanted to have a primary education system. Now Pennsylvania will go there first, led by Benjamin Rush. New England is really first because they just had a viewpoint that literacy was crucial to being a good Christian, so you could read the Bible. So they taught everybody, men and women, to read and to have basic education. Rush is the forbidden. They say, hey, we should do that. Meaning paid for by the state. You can see that he puts down a law of importing slavery. It was earlier in the slide, and I didn't highlight it. Now I wish I did, but it's too far for me to go back. When you look at Jefferson, this is why I say he's confounding, brilliant and confounding, and a scoundrel, is because, you know, you just go, Sally Hemings, and you're like, man, really? Like that's a frustration for Carl. It might not be for you, that's totally fine. But for me, I'm just like, right? Like you could have, Washington kept his slaves, but at least at his death, he made sure they were freed. At Martha's death, like there was no passing on to anybody. Free them. Jefferson doesn't do that, and he's not alone. But then, there's at least 4 moments when Jefferson, before he's the President of the United States, where he fights to either stop the importation of slavery or ban it outright. If not in Virginia, then in the extension of Virginia, which eventually becomes Southern Ohio. So it's this interesting aspect. Nobody's twisting his arm. You have to oppose slavery. He seemed to not like it. But yet, and there's a whole conversation which we've all probably been around or read or heard something about. I'm not trying to get in that conversation, but I just want you to see it, that in this 3-year thing, he's one of the radicals. We should abolish at least importation of slaves. And of course it doesn't happen. Neither of those became law. Some did of the laws that they proposed, others did not. He never leaves Virginia. In 83, he'll be elected to Congress. There's just a sense in which, when you get to, we can't get stuck here, Carl. When we get to the part where he begins to oppose Washington, I've said it this way again, why do you not like me? You're either Team Washington or you're Team Jefferson. You can't be on both. Because neither man will let you. And that's a longer conversation, which I need to explain. But when he starts looking, you start saying, why does he oppose? And one of the things, particularly from Hamilton, that Hamilton was the loudest about, George was too polite to say this openly, Washington, was that, look, dude, we were on the freaking front lines fighting the revolution, and you were sitting in Monticello. Well, that's not totally accurate, but to their minds, he didn't serve the way Ben Franklin, John Adams, all these other guys who left their families, went overseas, and all this other stuff. So it's always a battle that happens, but he is elected to be the governor, and the war comes to him. The war is coming his way. I know we're almost out of time. The war is coming his way. This is also the moment when he's elected governor that you can begin to see the outline of how he will view executive power and governance in his first moments of going from my theory is X to then in my practical experience, X doesn't work. Well, okay, by the way, I'm cool with that. I've changed my position on several things, but then I admit that. And I say, I changed my mind. Jefferson will never change it, never admit that he changes his mind on anything. He'll spend most of that time struggling because the executive position in the Virginia government at that time was a 1-year post. It was weak. You couldn't do a lot, which reflected the way they viewed, because we're rebelling against a single executive. Why would we set up another one just like it, kind of a thing, right? We won't call it king, but why give it the same powers? And then the war comes his way. If you know the American Revolutionary War part, the British were always misled by a strategic vision that there were loyalists in big numbers who were ready to rise up to support them. Now, there were loyalists who were ready to support them. There were more loyalists who I told you fought with, as far as regiments go. But in general, most people, I think, are kind of like me, which is like, I just want to stay out of it. Leave me alone. I just want to stay in my house. I don't really want to be involved. Do I think those guys are right? No, they're a bunch of crazy freaks burning houses down, but I don't want to get in the line of fire. Right? Maybe that makes me weak and you're stronger than I am, which I concede. But the point being made that most people want to stay out of it. So the British were always thinking the rebellion is only in Virginia and Massachusetts, which it wasn't, and in the middle colonies and in the southern colonies, north, south, Georgia, then they'll all help us. So when they take Charlestown, they're going after the rich elite. Remember I told you the southern rich elite are the ones who are really upset? So they take Charlestown, modern day Charleston. They take Charlestown, and then they think, great, the whole nation's going to come to us. And while Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, is not historically on point, it is a useful examination of what happens there, about the Civil War aspect that is going on, and the tensions that were existent even in those places. So I do actually encourage people to watch it, because it's useful in that regard, right? And so you have this picture where they're trying to raise people up. They win the Battle of Camden, the British do, and so yay, everything's going our way. So that's why when they'll have in December of 1780, they'll lead an invasion of Virginia. In December of 1780, the British are like, we've got this. We've got it locked in. We're going to pull this off. We're going to win. They're fooling themselves, but that's what they're thinking. And so here's where Jefferson shows to be a poor military strategist, which is not a complaint, although his neighbors will complain. He doesn't call out the militia. And then over the next weeks or so, as you can see here in 81, there's a whole series of things that happen, some to the positive, some to the negative. And eventually, Cornwallis, who's leading the British, will arrive in Virginia, having marched through North Carolina, not successfully. So he's kind of rolling in retreat, but he's still thinking we can win. And so he goes and tries to attack Richmond. And he basically comes very close to capturing the government. The government all flees in the process. And when the government flees in the process, there's another moment which the very famous Banastre Tarleton leads his cavalry units to go try to get Jefferson at Monticello. And they come very close, I mean hours. They're warned, Monticello is warned by a militia guy who recognized Tarleton. Is like, oh crap, I know where they're going, and goes backwoods and beats them there. And Jefferson and his family are able to escape. But in the process of all that, Jefferson resigns as the governor. So again, from the Virginians' point of view, there's again this moment when his actions are not the kind of leadership that we would need. Now, Jefferson's point was he was not going to run for a third time, and the end of the year was typically the end of the role of the governor. So it was sort of his way of saying, yeah, you'll pick somebody new. But he didn't wait. It's a picky thing. I sort of agree with Jefferson. They're being a little ultra picky. But as you can see here, once the war had died down, in June, the assembly will basically censor him. They will call his conduct into inquiry. And he'll spend the rest of his life amongst Virginians kind of fighting over this. There'll be an inquiry. He'll win, he'll be exonerated, but still there's a sense in which there's this lingering taint that goes with him of you failed as a leader, which is interesting that didn't play a bigger role when he runs for office in 96 and then 1800, but it doesn't. We're almost done, I promise. This is when his wife dies, 82. His wife dies in 82. This is another moment in which it seems like he was going to have a nervous breakdown. In fact, some of his friends believed he was suicidal, which, again, he loved his wife. They had a very close and endearing relationship. So that's not like a weird thing to have that much devastation. I pointed out to us just to know that here yet again is this moment in which the storyline that we know of America, in which Jefferson is such a huge part of that story. I mean, he's on Mount Rushmore, right? That story could have easily not happened. His friends try to get him back to Paris. They gave him choice. He rejects it again. He's like, no, I'm not leaving. I'm not going there. And so then he does, after Martha dies, and he has a grieving moment, there's a sense in which that call to service in Paris, which doesn't happen, kind of jolts him into the Jefferson that we will know for the rest of the journey. He'll stay single on her deathbed. She says, I don't want you to marry anybody, which is partially why the Sally Hemings things happens, because he was a man who loved women. He was a virile man of youthful age at that time. And again, I'm trying to get too trapped in something. There's zero evidence from the Hemings family that she was raped. I know for many of us, we hear the slave relationship. In many cases, that's exactly what happened. The white master raped the woman who was enslaved to him. Horrific. And then often, to double down on how horrible you can be, sold their own children into slavery down the river so they didn't have to see them as a reminder to their indiscretion. That's not Thomas Jefferson. That's not what he did. And again, just taking it from the Hemings point of view, but that's part of like what happens, like why does she get into the story, which again is happening in Paris, which we will not get to today. He gets a chance to write again, Notes of Virginia. It's very important, kind of a ethnological look at Virginia and the early United States. He's answering questions about what Virginia is. He's answering questions about what the United States is, but he's doing it through a Virginia lens. And again, in here, he opposes slavery. He openly writes that slavery is like this bad thing we should get rid of. But he also supports a white supremacy openly. In his mind, slaves need to be moved away once they're free, kind of a thing. That inconsistency that even Abraham Lincoln had later, the idea of them living together. And then this gets us to the end. He'll serve in Congress. He'll then go to France in '84 under the new government as an ambassador. He replaces Franklin, who comes home. While he's there, he sees the French Revolution begin, has a very significant role in what happens in the French Revolution, both in the writing of Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen and in their 1791 constitutional government. Comes back not to come home. So the Hamilton story, like he's coming home for that. No, he just was coming home for a break, was going to go back. And then when he got home, hey, we've had the election. He knew that part. You've been asked to be Secretary of State, which he almost turned down because he wanted to go back to France. But then decides to stay. This is, I think, the first real moment where you have the influence of Madison helping him see a bigger vision than he could see himself. This leads to the 1790 to 93 battles with Hamilton, where he ultimately resigns. I just love this part. He begs and badgers Washington, who they knew each other for a long time as Virginia planters. Washington wants to resign, and Jefferson's like, you have to stay, you have to stay, you have to stay. Okay, I'll stay. Good, I'm quitting. Really? Then, as you know, in 96, becoming second to Adams, he's vice president. And then in 1800, he's elected the third president. And then this is the wonderful stuff. His first term of office is arguably the best first term of any president. And it's coming from somebody who doesn't like him, as you know. His first term was solid. And so you can see the various things he did. Thomas Jefferson, complicated, very complicated. And there's more to his story, which we may come back to later. But nonetheless, this is that brilliant, confounding writer, scoundrel, who plays this role in our national history. And with that, we'll leave it right there. We come to the end. Thank you. Does anybody I want to go to this one for the QR code, and I'll come back in a second if you want to see, to listen. If you want to get this. You may have any questions you want to ask. I may have a few seconds left. I'll stay down here below, obviously, for any of those who would like to come ask me privately. I really appreciate you guys being here. It helps the library, supporting our library is an amazing library. I hope you have a wonderful day, and if I don't see you before the 4th, have a wonderful July 4th Independence celebration. All right, see you.